Good morning to everyone watching. My name is Clara Miller, and I'm 88 years old. I'm telling you this story today because I've come to a point in my life where I realize some things are too heavy to carry alone, even after so many years. They begin to weigh on you, and if you don't find a way to let them go, they can suffocate you. My story is one of struggle, of defiance, and of a battle for a voice in a world that didn't want to hear it. But it's also a story of a woman who found her strength in the most unlikely of places. It's a tale of how a young girl, born to be a wife and a mother, became a war correspondent, a social justice advocate, and most of all, her own person. I hope that by the end of my story, you will find a little piece of courage in your own heart to face whatever you're going through. I was born in 1902 in a small town in Massachusetts, in a house with a white picket fence, a garden my mother tended with the most incredible care, and a father who believed that a woman's place was, first and foremost, in the home. I was the eldest of 4 children, with 2 brothers and a younger sister, all of whom my parents loved dearly. My father, a respected lawyer, was a man of firm convictions and even firmer discipline. His word was law in our house, just as it was in his office. He believed in order, tradition, and the sanctity of the family unit. He believed that the world had a preordained role for everyone, and a woman's role was to be the heart of the home, to raise children, and to support her husband. My mother was a gentle, quiet woman who fully embraced this role. She was a master of the domestic arts and managed our household with a quiet grace that my father admired. But even in the midst of this seemingly perfect, traditional life, I felt a restlessness inside me, a deep curiosity that could not be contained by the 4 walls of our home. I wanted to know what was happening in the world. My first great escape was through books. My father, who believed in a proper education, had a large library, full of classics, legal texts, and history books. While my brothers were outside playing, I was in that library, devouring every book I could get my hands on. I read about brave women who disguised themselves as men to fight in wars, about queens who ruled nations, and about thinkers who changed the world with their ideas. But most of all, I was fascinated by the newspapers that came to our house every morning. I remember the smell of the fresh ink, the crispness of the paper, and the headlines that screamed of events happening far, far away. I would read about the latest scientific discoveries, the political scandals in Washington, and the struggles of ordinary people. And I wanted to be a part of it all. I wanted to not just read the news, I wanted to write it. I wanted to tell the stories of people whose voices weren't being heard. My father saw my obsession with reading, but he didn't see my ambition. He simply thought I was a bright girl who would make an excellent companion for a future husband. He would often tell me that too much knowledge was a dangerous thing for a woman. "It makes you headstrong, Clara," he would say. "A man wants a gentle wife, not a competitor." But I could not be molded into the image he had of a perfect woman. My thoughts were too loud, my curiosity too insatiable. I had dreams of a life far beyond the white picket fence of our home, dreams that would soon be put to the test. My first true act of defiance came when I was 16. The local newspaper, the Oakwood Gazette, was offering a small prize for an essay contest on the importance of local government. My father, who was deeply involved in local politics, encouraged my brothers to enter, but told me that my place was to stay home and help my mother prepare for the upcoming town hall dinner. I agreed, but secretly, I stayed up late every night, writing my essay. I didn't write a dry piece about the importance of city council meetings. Instead, I wrote a passionate article about the need for women to have a say in their community, to be active participants in the decisions that affected their lives. I didn't sign my name. I used the pseudonym C. Miller. A week later, I saw my essay published on the front page. My father, who never read the opinion section, was none the wiser, but my mother, whose quiet curiosity was always more observant than anyone knew, looked at me with a knowing smile. "That was a very brave thing to do, Clara," she said softly. "But you must be careful. Your father would not be pleased." I knew she was right, but the thrill of seeing my words in print, of knowing that my voice had reached a wide audience, was intoxicating. That small victory ignited a fire in me, a fire that would prove to be both my greatest strength and the source of my greatest pain. I began to write more, articles on everything from the need for a new bridge in town to the importance of public libraries. I continued to use my pseudonym and submitted my work to various publications, hoping to make a small living from my passion. I managed to earn a few dollars here and there, money I carefully saved and hid away in a small box under my bed, a secret fund for my future. I knew that to truly pursue my dream, I had to leave home. The moment I turned 18, I made a decision that would change the course of my life forever. I told my father that I wanted to go to Boston to find work. He was furious. "A decent girl doesn't leave home without a husband," he bellowed. "What will people say? You will ruin our family's reputation." My mother, surprisingly, came to my defense. "Arthur, let her go," she said. "She's a smart girl, and she has a good head on her shoulders. She can find a good husband in the city, and she'll have an adventure." Her words were a lie, but it was a merciful lie that my father, in his heart, was willing to believe. He gave me a small amount of money and told me that if I did not find a respectable job within 6 months, I was to come home and accept the first proper proposal I received. I accepted his terms and left a few days later, with my little box of savings and a heart full of hope and fear. I arrived in Boston in 1920. The city was a world away from my small town. It was loud, chaotic, and full of possibilities. The first thing I did was visit the biggest newspaper in the city, the Boston Chronicle. I walked into the grand lobby, my heart pounding in my chest, and asked to speak to the editor-in-chief, a formidable man named Mr. Harrington. He was a gruff man with a stern face and an even sterner reputation, and he looked at me, a young girl from the countryside, with a look of pure contempt. He told me that they did not hire women for man's work like journalism, and that I should go back home and find a respectable husband. His words were a crushing blow, but I refused to give up. I begged him to at least look at my writing samples, the articles I had written under my pseudonym. He scoffed, but reluctantly took my folder. I left his office feeling completely defeated. But a week later, I received a letter. It was from Mr. Harrington. He had a job for me. Not as a journalist, but as his personal secretary. "It's a way for you to get your foot in the door," the letter said, "and to see if you have what it takes to survive in this business." It was not what I had hoped for, but it was a start, and I accepted. It was the beginning of my true education. For the next 2 years, I was Mr. Harrington's shadow. I spent my days in the newsroom, a chaotic symphony of clicking typewriters, shouted commands, and the ever-present smell of ink and coffee. I answered phones, sorted mail, and took dictation, all while observing the hustle and bustle of a world I so desperately wanted to be a part of. My mind, a sponge, soaked up everything. I learned the rhythm of a deadline, the importance of a compelling lead, and the art of telling a story with a few well-chosen words. But no matter how hard I worked, or how much I learned, I was still just a secretary. A woman in a man's world. My chance finally came in 1922. The newspaper was doing a series on modern women, and the male reporter assigned to the story, a young man named Jack, was struggling to get women to open up to him. Mr. Harrington, in a moment of frustration, threw his hands up and said, "Clara, you're a woman, maybe you can talk to them. Try to get something out of them." I was ecstatic. It was my first assignment, and I approached it with a quiet determination. I interviewed factory workers, college students, and women who were running for local office. I didn't write about their clothes or their husbands. I wrote about their dreams, their struggles, and their desire for a life beyond the domestic sphere. I wrote about their voices. My articles were a sensation. They were honest, raw, and they resonated with the women of Boston in a way that no one had anticipated. Mr. Harrington, much to his surprise, put me on the front page. My name, Clara Miller, was in a bold headline for the first time. I was no longer just a secretary. I was a journalist. My success was a double-edged sword. While it gave me a platform, it also made me a target. My articles on women's rights and social issues were popular with the general public, but they infuriated certain powerful men in the city. The most powerful of these men was a real estate tycoon named Richard Sterling. He was a man who believed that women's place was at home, and that my articles were a dangerous influence on society. He had tried to get the newspaper to fire me, but my articles were too popular, and my name was becoming a brand. He couldn't attack my work directly, so he began a quiet, insidious campaign against me personally. He spread rumors that I was a headstrong, loose woman who would stop at nothing to get a story, and he used his influence to make sure I was a pariah in Boston's elite social circles. I was invited to parties and events, but as soon as I entered, people would turn their backs to me. It was a cruel and isolating experience. I was in my mid-20s, and I was a rising star. But I was also completely alone. I had no friends, no romantic interests, and my family, who had heard the rumors, had cut me off completely. My father sent me a letter, telling me that I had brought shame to our family name, and that I was no longer welcome in their home. My mother, in a separate letter, told me that she was sorry, but she couldn't go against my father's wishes. I felt a crushing loneliness, but I refused to give up. I believed that my work was important, and I was determined to tell the stories of women who were still living in the shadows. I knew that Richard Sterling's hatred was a sign that I was doing something right, and I was determined not to let him win. I was about to embark on a project that would be the most dangerous and controversial of my career. It was a story about the working conditions in Richard Sterling's factories, a story of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. I knew that if I published it, it would be the end of my career, but it was a risk I was willing to take. I knew that to tell the truth, I had to be willing to lose everything. I spent months investigating Richard Sterling's factories. I interviewed dozens of women who worked there, listening to their stories of long hours, low wages, and dangerous working conditions. I found a way to get inside the factories myself, disguised as a factory worker, and I saw with my own eyes the squalid conditions and the abuse these women endured. I collected my evidence, wrote my article, and turned it into Mr. Harrington. He read it in silence, his face a mask of concern. "Clara," he said, his voice grave. "This is a masterpiece. But if we publish it, it will destroy us. Sterling will use every resource he has to ruin this newspaper, and he'll ruin you along with it." I knew he was right, but I was determined to see it through. "Mr. Harrington," I said, "these women deserve to have their stories told. They are suffering in silence, and someone has to speak for them." He looked at me, a young woman with a fire in her eyes, and he saw not just a journalist, but a moral compass. He made a decision that would prove to be his last great act as an editor. He published my article on the front page of the Sunday edition. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Richard Sterling, a man who believed himself untouchable, was exposed as a monster. The public was outraged, and the demand for a government investigation was deafening. But Sterling, a man of immense power and influence, was not going to go down without a fight. He used his connections to pressure the newspaper's advertisers to pull their business. He filed a lawsuit against the Boston Chronicle for defamation, a lawsuit that had no merit, but was designed to bleed us dry in legal fees. He used his influence with the police to have me arrested on trumped-up charges of trespassing and inciting a riot. The newspaper was forced to fire me, and Mr. Harrington, who had suffered a heart attack from the stress, was forced to retire. I was blacklisted in the entire journalism industry. No one would hire me. I was a pariah, a woman who had dared to challenge a man's power and had been utterly crushed for it. I spent the next 2 years in a state of quiet despair. I was completely alone, and I had no money. I was living in a cheap boarding house, and I was barely surviving. I thought about giving up. I thought about going home and begging for my father's forgiveness. But I couldn't. I couldn't go back to the world I had left behind, a world where women were silent and submissive. I knew that I had lost the battle, but I refused to let my spirit be broken. I took a job as a waitress to pay my bills, and in my spare time, I wrote. I wrote for myself, pouring all my pain and frustration onto the pages of my journal. I wrote about the injustices I had seen, the power of a single voice, and the courage it took to stand up for what you believe in. I knew that one day, my voice would be heard again. I just had to wait for the right moment. That moment came in 1925, with the United States' entry into World War I. I saw a chance to leave my past behind and to find a new purpose. I volunteered to be a nurse with the American Red Cross and was sent to France. The war was a horrific and life-changing experience. I saw things I had never imagined. The suffering was unimaginable, the destruction was absolute, and the human spirit, a fragile and beautiful thing, was being tested to its limits. But even in the midst of this darkness, I saw stories. Stories of courage, of sacrifice, and of hope. I saw the incredible strength of the nurses, the soldiers, and the civilians who were living through this nightmare. I knew that I had to tell their stories. I had to show the world the truth about the war, and I had to do it with my pen. I began to write again, this time with a new sense of urgency. I wrote about the young men I saw dying in the hospital beds, their last words a desperate plea for their mothers. I wrote about the women who had lost their husbands, their sons, and their homes, but who still found the strength to rebuild their lives. I wrote about the courage of the doctors and nurses, and the tireless work they did to save lives. My articles were honest, raw, and they were not a story of glory or patriotism. They were a story of human suffering and human resilience. I began sending them to various newspapers in the United States, signing them with a new pseudonym, the Nightingale. My articles were a sensation. They were a raw and honest portrayal of the war, a far cry from the sanitized propaganda that the public was used to seeing. The public was hungry for the truth, and my articles were a glimpse into a world they had only seen from a distance. Back in the United States, the Nightingale was a mystery. No one knew who she was, but everyone wanted to know. The articles were syndicated in major newspapers across the country, and I was becoming a celebrated figure. My writing was a voice for the voiceless, a powerful testament to the human spirit in the face of unspeakable horror. I wrote about the suffrage movement, about the women who were marching for their rights back home, and about the importance of giving women a voice in the world. I wrote about the strength of women, not just as mothers and wives, but as thinkers, as leaders, and as the future of a society that had long been dominated by men. My work was not just journalism. It was a social commentary. After the war ended in 1918, I returned to the United States a new woman. I was no longer the frightened girl who had left her home years ago. I was a veteran of the war, a celebrated journalist, and a woman who had found her voice. When I arrived in Boston, the Boston Chronicle was waiting for me. They had a job offer for me, as a senior writer and editor. I accepted, but only on one condition, that I would have complete creative control over my work, and that I would never be censored. They agreed. My first article was a powerful piece about the women who had served in the war, the nurses and the volunteers who had risked their lives to save others. It was a tribute to their courage, and a powerful call to action for women's suffrage. The article was a sensation, and it was a public declaration that I was back. Richard Sterling, the man who had tried to destroy me, was now a powerless figure. His reputation had been destroyed by the very scandals he had tried to cover up. He was no longer the powerful man he once was, and he couldn't touch me. He was a ghost from my past, a shadow I had finally outrun. I had won. But I was not just a woman who had won a battle. I was a woman who had found her purpose, her voice, and her place in the world. I was no longer defined by the man who had tried to silence me. I was defined by my words, my courage, and my determination to tell the truth. My return to the Boston Chronicle was more than a professional comeback, it was a vindication. The newsroom, once a place of tension and whispers, now hummed with a different energy. I was no longer an outsider. I was the Nightingale, a war hero, a celebrated voice. My colleagues, men who had once looked down on me, now came to me for advice, for a glimpse into the raw truth of the world. Mr. Harrington, now retired but still a frequent visitor, would smile knowingly from his armchair, a silent nod to the victory we had won together. But my real battle was still being fought, not in a newsroom, but in the streets of America. The women's suffrage movement was at a fever pitch. Women were marching, protesting, and demanding their right to vote. I threw myself into the cause, using my newfound platform to amplify their voices. I wrote a series of articles titled "The Women Who Won the War," arguing that if women were brave enough to serve on the battlefield, to run factories at home, and to hold society together in the absence of men, they were certainly brave enough to cast a ballot. My words were a powerful counter-argument to the patriarchal voices who claimed that women were too emotional or too fragile for politics. I chronicled the rallies, the arrests, and the quiet dignity of the suffragettes who refused to be silenced. I gave a face and a name to the women who were making history. My journalistic focus shifted from reporting on events to being a catalyst for them. I wasn't just observing. I was actively shaping the public conversation. I was invited to speak at rallies and conventions, my voice reaching thousands. I saw the power of a single story, a single voice, to move a nation. And I saw that my true calling was to use my voice for something more than just a byline. It was a calling to fight for justice, to advocate for the oppressed, and to challenge the status quo. I was a crusading journalist, and I would not rest until I saw the change I was fighting for. The passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920 was a moment of immense triumph. I was in a crowded square in Boston, surrounded by women who were crying, hugging, and celebrating. I felt a sense of purpose and pride that I had never known before. It was a victory not just for women, but for the entire nation. It was a testament to the power of a collective voice, of a fierce determination to be heard. My own victory against Richard Sterling now seemed small in comparison. He had tried to silence one woman, but he had failed to stop a movement. He had tried to break me, but in the end, he had made me stronger. I knew then that my story was no longer just about me. It was about all of us, about the fight for equality and justice. With the suffrage movement won, my focus shifted to other, equally important battles. The 1920s were a time of great change, but also of great inequality. The booming economy of the Roaring Twenties brought immense wealth to a few, but left many in poverty. I used my platform to expose the darker side of the American dream. I wrote about the plight of factory workers, the corruption of big corporations, and the struggles of immigrant families who came to America seeking a better life, only to find themselves exploited. My articles were not always popular. They made powerful people uncomfortable, but I knew that making people uncomfortable was a necessary part of a journalist's job. My work brought me into contact with all kinds of people. I interviewed labor leaders, suffragettes, and civil rights pioneers. I became a mentor to young journalists, both men and women, who were hungry for a chance to make a difference. I taught them that journalism was not just about reporting facts. It was about telling human stories. It was about giving a voice to the voiceless. I was a grand woman, not because of the number of my bylines, but because of the number of lives my words had touched. I was a part of something bigger than myself, a part of a legacy of justice and truth. I had a chance at a different kind of life in the late 1920s. I met a wonderful man, a doctor named Arthur, who was kind, intelligent, and who saw me for who I was, not just for my reputation. We fell in love, and for a moment, I considered a different path. He asked me to marry him, and for a moment, I considered it. I imagined a life of quiet domesticity, of love and companionship, and of a family of my own. But then, I thought of the stories that were still waiting to be told, the injustices that were still waiting to be exposed, and the world that was still waiting to be changed. I realized that my life's work was my family. My words were my children. I told Arthur that I couldn't marry him, but that I would love him forever. He understood. He saw that my commitment was not just to a job, but to a calling. We remained friends, and our love, while never a traditional one, was a beautiful and powerful force in my life. I was in my late 20s when the Great Depression hit. The world was plunged into a state of chaos and despair. I was a witness to the breadlines, the shantytowns, and the quiet dignity of a people who had lost everything. I wrote about their struggles, their resilience, and their refusal to give up. I showed the world the human face of the economic crisis. My stories were a source of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit could endure. I was a journalist, but I was also a historian, a chronicler of a nation's soul. As the decades passed, my work continued to evolve. In the late 1930s, the rise of fascism in Europe was impossible to ignore. I traveled to Germany, where I saw with my own eyes the rise of a dangerous ideology. I wrote about the persecution of the Jews, the suppression of dissent, and the terrifying charisma of a man who was leading his nation to ruin. My articles were a stark warning to the American people, a desperate plea for them to see the danger that was coming. My work was not just about reporting, it was about preventing a tragedy. When the war broke out, I was one of the first journalists to report from the front lines, my old skills as a nurse coming in handy. I covered the London Blitz, the Allied invasion of France, and the liberation of the concentration camps. I was no longer the Nightingale. I was Clara Miller, war correspondent, a woman who had seen the worst of humanity, but who had not lost her hope in its capacity for good. My articles were not just stories. They were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. They were a reminder that even in the face of absolute evil, there are people who will choose to fight for what is right. I was a voice for the survivors, for the victims, and for the heroes who fought to save them. After the war, I returned to America a changed woman. I had seen the world in all its ugliness and all its beauty. I had a deeper understanding of the human condition, of the fragility of peace, and of the importance of standing up for what you believe in. I continued to work as a journalist, covering the post-war era, the Cold War, and the civil rights movement. I saw the world change in ways I could never have imagined. I saw men walk on the moon, I saw a president assassinated, and I saw a nation divided by war and protest. I wrote about it all, with the same passion and the same conviction that had guided me from the very beginning. My body began to slow down in my later years, but my mind was as sharp as ever. I retired from journalism, but I never stopped writing. I wrote my memoirs, a testament to a life lived without regret. I wrote about the quiet courage of my mother, the stubborn pride of my father, and the incredible kindness of the man who had loved me for who I was. I wrote about my time as the Nightingale and the women who had taught me the true meaning of strength. I wrote about my belief that a woman's place is wherever she chooses to be, and that a single voice, a single story, can change the world. My life was not a conventional one. I never had a husband or children. But my life was a rich and full one. My family was the thousands of readers who had followed my journey, the people who had been touched by my words, and the young journalists I had mentored. My legacy was not just my bylines. It was the change I had helped to bring about. It was the voices I had amplified. It was the hope I had helped to inspire. I was a grand woman, not because of a title, but because of my life's work. When I look back on my life, on the young girl who read history books in her father's library, the young woman who was blacklisted for telling the truth, and the war correspondent who saw the worst of humanity but refused to lose hope, I am a testament to the power of one person to make a difference. I lived a life of purpose and meaning, and I have no regrets. The world is a different place now, a place that is more just, more equal, and more hopeful than the one I grew up in. I like to think that in my own small way, I helped to make it so. I was once told that a woman's place was in the home, that my dreams were dangerous, that I should be silent. But I chose to be a writer. I chose to be a witness. I chose to be a voice. I chose to be a grand woman. And I hope that my story inspires you to choose the same for yourself. Every great woman has a story, and this is mine. It is a story of a woman who was a product of her time, but who refused to be a prisoner of it. A story of a woman who chose to be a force of nature, a voice for change, and a testament to the power of one person to make a difference. If my story has touched your heart, if it has inspired you to be braver, to be bolder, and to live your life on your own terms, I hope you will share it with others. Please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and leave a comment below. It means the world to me that my story has found a home in your heart. Thank you for listening to an old woman's tale. Remember, you have a voice, and the world is waiting to hear it.